Indian journalists in China have been operating with certain difficulties, such as not being permitted to hire locals as correspondents or as journalists.
Lost Indian journalist in Beijing has been asked to pack his bags. In a shocking development, the Chinese government asked PTI journalists to leave China by the end of this month. Earlier, a Hindustan Times reporter had to leave China after his visa was denied renewal. India-China relations continue to worsen after Beijing claimed that there is unfair and discriminatory arrangement for Chinese journalists in India. India vehemently denied China's allegations and said that in fact it is China which is not allowing Indian journalists to work freely, and that Indian journalists are facing difficulties as they are not allowed to hire Chinese locals for operations.
All foreign journalists, including Chinese journalists, have been pursuing journalist activities in India without any limitations or difficulties in reporting or in doing their media coverage. Meanwhile, Indian journalists in China have been operating with certain difficulties, such as not being permitted to hire locals as correspondents or as journalists. As you know, foreign media in India here can and do freely hire local journalists to work for their bureaus in India. We also are aware that Indian journalists face several restrictions, that is, Indian journalists in China face several restrictions while getting access and traveling locally within China. Indian side supports and facilitates foreign journalists in India, and I'm sure you can attest to it, those of you who are foreign journalists here. At the same time, there should be no deviations from normal journalistic behavior and activities or from the provisions governing journalist visas that are issued to journalists. We would hope that Chinese authorities facilitate the continued presence of Indian journalists in working and reporting from China, and the two sides continue to remain in touch.
The ongoing conflict between India and China over the treatment of their respective journalists spiraled after Beijing on June 12th asked the last Indian journalist to leave China by the end of this month. With the departure of PTI journalists, India's total media presence in China will come down to zero. Indian media outlets had 4 reporters based in China at the beginning of 2023. Out of the 4, Hindustan Times reporter left over the weekend, and 2 Indian journalists from Prasar Bharati and The Hindu were denied visa renewals in April. Meanwhile, China had 14 journalists in India in 2020. That number has now come down to just 1. The visa spat between India and China began a few months ago over Indian journalists hiring assistants in China to help with reporting. Beijing imposed strict measures limiting employment to 3 individuals at a time who must come from a pool provided by the Chinese authorities. However, India does not have any such cap on hiring.